Well, I am here with Josh. Hey, Josh.
Hey, Daniel, good to be here.
Good to have you, man. We were talking about his new book, What Are You Waiting For? A Young Leader's Guide to Changing the World. I love this book. And so, in your book, Josh, you describe some surprisingly young leaders from the Bible. And can you describe some of those leaders here?
Yeah, I mean, when you think about it, many of the Bible heroes or characters that we have in our minds, and you start reading their stories, you realize, whoa, many of these men and women are pretty young. Like, I don't know what people typically picture, but sometimes when we picture people like Daniel from Scripture, we picture kind of old man Daniel, but we forget those early chapters of his story where he was a teenager, right? Being brought into the Babylonian Empire. And so, yeah, many of these characters. There's kind of the obvious ones like David as a young shepherd boy. You have Mary, right? Likely at most 14 years old when the angel appears to her. And then other ones like Esther and Ruth and Samuel, when, again, Samuel has got this long story. And yet, at the beginning of the story, he's this young boy who hears from God after a season of prophetic silence. And so you have all these kind of characters, and then there's characters like Gideon, who we don't necessarily know that he's young, but he, in his own mind at least, is unqualified. He considers himself the weakest in his father's house. And so, yeah, many of the characters in Scripture, when you start looking at their journey, it begins with them as teenagers.
Yeah. When Goliath, the warrior, was challenging the Israelite army, put forward your greatest champion, we'll fight to the death. It was young David who said, I'll do it. And everyone's like, seriously, you? You, Josh, have your own story, maybe more than one, just of being the young person in the room to say, I'll do it. And everyone's like, what? Could you kind of tell us that story?
Yeah, for sure. So this kind of goes back to how, our church got planted, how our church got started is I was a part of a multi-site church. We had two campuses and we knew we needed to pivot and to do something different. We were in a lead pastor search process, and we ended up finding someone, but he resigned after a week due to kind of family things. And so we were in this really uncertain, tumultuous season. And essentially the idea of, well, what if each of these campuses became local churches themselves, right? Simplify the structure, kind of be able to explore kind of, the context and do ministry to those specific neighborhoods. And then the question is, okay, if we're going to move that way, who will lead them? And I was the campus pastor at the time, and I was like, I'll totally lead the church that I'm the campus pastor of. And I had been the campus pastor of that church for less than 6 months at that point in time. And I came out of youth ministry, so I wasn't like brand new, but I was 26 years old. And people in the room, like the decision makers in the room were like, okay, have you ever done a budget for, a church? Do you even have a budget for your house? There was all these kinds of questions about, qualifications and education and experience. And it was definitely, I resonate with that moment where David is telling Saul, I'll do it. And he puts on the armor, and the armor is like way too big for him, kind of like he's in over his head. And he's just like this, from external appearances, it looks like he's not equipped. He can't do it. Of course, David goes on to slay the giant, and he does so really leaning and relying on God's power and God's strength. And the fact that he was unqualified is an opportunity for God to use him in a unique way. And that's what I've seen in my ministry journey. I ended up really being given permission to take that church and launch it. And God has used our church in many ways. And I look at that not because I'm the greatest leader, but I look at that as really because of those gaps. It was more of an opportunity to rely on God and depend on God throughout that whole journey. And so I think there is wisdom of older seasoned leaders actually giving those opportunities to people who maybe don't have the experience that the world is telling them they need, because they're uniquely positioned to rely on God in really cool ways.
Yeah, and just imagine, and this is kind of what your book does for us. Imagine if a church full of young people raise their hand and they say, I'll do it, and in a humble way and a hey, how can I serve way. If they get in the game, imagine what could happen.
Yeah, I mean, it's powerful stuff to consider if you were to unleash the next generation of kingdom leaders. And there's some kind of things that maybe scare established leaders about that. Well, they're going to start making decisions. They're going to start changing everything. And it's like exactly they're going to start making decisions to help reach their generation and the generations coming up behind them. And so, yeah, I think it's really the possibilities of seeing new, inexperienced leaders get into God's calling on their lives is very exciting to me.
Yeah. In the book, you write young leaders can have more fight in them because they don't know what they're up against. So, what are some of the challenges that young leaders in particular face? What are they up against?
Yeah, so I think, for David, right, everyone else has seen Goliath come out, right, day after day after day. They pretty well have him sized up, you know. But David shows up and he's like, "Oh, I'll fight him." And he like day one, who's that guy? Like he doesn't even have a full maybe awareness and maybe even a childlike like he's a little bit naive in some ways about what he's going to have to face. And I think some of the thing and that can be a strength at times, right? Where you if you don't know how scary something is, maybe you take the leap anyways, right? And I think lack of
I mean,
experience.
marriage, right?
Yeah, yeah.
You don't know what you're getting into.
There's a certain element of like it's almost better not to know how difficult, how hard something's going to be, because sometimes you just have to make that leap. You just have to take that jump. And one of those ways that young leaders are going to be up against is, I hate to almost even like kind of give too much insight into this, but just lack of credibility is one that people are gonna, if somebody's like, hey, I'm going to do something significant, I'm going to do something amazing, even if you have a really encouraging and supportive community around you that's like, yeah, you can do it, you're going to inevitably come up against people who are like, who are you? What are you, 12? I remember I had a lady come up to me before I preached a Christmas Eve service, and she was like, you're the pastor, what are you, 12? And I was like, that's not exactly what I need to hear before I go and preach the gospel to hundreds of people, right? And so you're gonna have people who kind of like are the naysayers, who are gonna be like, show me your credentials, or they're gonna have this concept of lack of credibility. And that can, in some ways, I think, create a little bit of insecurity as well. There's gonna be some insecurities that just come from kind of not knowing what you're doing all the time. And I think the best way to deal with that is just to be honest about that and learn and really kind of like be a learner and seek to grow through all the things that you're going through. But insecurity is another one that's going to pop up. You're going to find yourself, maybe even if you're really confident at the outset. I mean, I wonder sometimes if in David and Goliath that he sees Goliath across the valley and he's like, oh yeah, I can totally do that. And he talks to King Saul, he goes and gets the smooth stones. I wonder at times if he's like, the time comes for him to actually step foot on the battlefield, if he's like, whoa, that guy's a little bit bigger than I realized. And maybe insecurity begins to creep in. But once again, I think dealing with those things, just being dependent on God, creates the opportunity for God to do amazing things, really, in spite of all of the obstacles and all the barriers that people are going to face.
So, in your book, What Are You Waiting For? You talk about 7 strengths that young people naturally have that uniquely position them to be world changers. And so, in order to encourage the young person who might be watching this video, can you describe just one of these strengths that they're likely to kind of already have as young people?
Yeah, so I think the strength that David exemplifies is what I call fight. Some people might call it grit or perseverance, but it's essentially the idea to keep going even when things get difficult. And I think a young person is like there's a few reasons why I think the younger you are, the more likely you are to have this strength. But one of those reasons is simply because you have higher energy when you're younger. I think one of the reasons why nobody else in the Israelite army steps up to the battlefield is because they're kind of beaten down, they're discouraged, they're tired from, they're even they depleted of food. David's there primarily to bring food provisions for his brothers who are old enough to fight in the army. David's been eating good meals for weeks. Like he's been hanging out with the sheep. He's been living like he's fresh. And there is that line, he's fresh for the fight. And I think that the younger you are, in some ways, the less battle scars you have. Well, at the same time, those things do give you wisdom and experience. The more fresh you are, the more likely you are to be able to weather some of those difficulties, those trials that come your way. And of course, there's going to be spiritual attacks. There's going to be, like things are just going to get difficult as soon as you raise your hand and say, I'm going to do something for God's kingdom. I'm going to get in the game. I'm going to enter the battlefield. But being fresh and being willing to just fight, to just keep getting up, even when things get difficult, to not give up so easily, I think that is one of the incredible strengths that, again, not everyone is necessarily like super strong in perseverance naturally, but the younger you are, I think the more accessible it is to you than somebody who, let's say, is on the brink of burnout, somebody who's been at this for a while and they're like, you know what, I need another vacation, right? I just think of like the energy level. I have 3 young kids and they, kids have high energy, right? It's just part of like physically, they have a lot of energy the younger that they are. And I think some of that translates into your early years as a teenager and a young adult, your early years in leadership, that's an incredible asset to be able to just simply, even if you don't know what you're doing, you can keep moving forward. You can keep at it because you have maybe a little bit more fire, a little bit more fight in you.
And you are now a bit more seasoned than when you first raised your hand and said, hey, I'll lead this church. How, on the days when you're needing strength, how do you renew your strength? What are a couple practical ways that you tap into?
Yeah, for sure. I think like recognizing that being fresh is such an important aspect about showing up, about perseverance. I learned kind of a good rhythm of rest from those early years in ministry. I've taken a weekly Sabbath with my family, kind of leaving work at work, not checking emails, not working at home, that sort of thing, so I can rest well. I'm a huge believer in having a good balance. People talk about a work-life balance. I think it's better to think about a work-rest balance. And so I work really hard, but I also rest hard. And when it's time to rest, I think, there's those, people try to catch up with vacations, like, putting a lot of expectations on a 2-week vacation or whatever. The reality is we need that rhythm ongoing in our lives. And so that's another thing that young people have a benefit with, is they can establish rhythms when they're young, when they're starting off, that they take with them the rest of their lives. And so there's a lot less unlearning that has to happen for somebody who's just starting off, right? And if they can recognize, like, no, fight is a strength I have, and it comes from being fresh, being well rested, I'm going to actually learn that rhythm now. I'm going to dial that in now, and I'm going to take that with me. And so that's been one of the ways that, I don't know. I when my haircut short, I do have a few more gray hairs than when I got started, and almost a decade later, those are the things that have continued to serve me well as a leader.